Let's be honest for a second. A lot of people get excited about building their first raised bed right up until the part where they actually have to fill it. That's usually the moment the whole thing changes. Because on paper, a raised bed sounds clean, simple, beginner-friendly. You build the box, you buy the soil, you plant the tomatoes, done. That's the dream. But then you stand in the garden center, or you're filling an online cart, and you start doing the math. A 4x8 bed that's 1 foot deep does not look that big when it's empty. It looks very big when you realize how many bags it takes to fill it. And that's where people get pushed into a really expensive habit that somehow got normalized as the right way to garden. You're told to fill the whole thing, top to bottom, with premium raised bed mix. Brand name bags, nice label, big promise, maybe Kellogg, maybe Miracle Grow, maybe whatever your local store has stacked out front in spring. And look, some of those products are perfectly fine. That's not really the problem. The problem is using your most valuable material in the least thoughtful way possible. Because once you start treating the entire raised bed like one uniform block that needs the same soil from top to bottom, you end up paying premium money for space that is not doing premium work. That's the part a lot of beginners never hear. Not all parts of a raised bed need to do the same job. And once you understand that, the whole system changes. What looked like a soil bill starts turning into a design question. What is this top layer actually for? What is the bottom half actually for? What can be built instead of bought? And maybe more importantly, what are you really trying to create here? A box full of expensive material? Or a bed that starts helping you back? Because those are not the same thing. And honestly, that difference is where a lot of raised bed advice falls apart. It sells the bed like a product. What we should be building is a system. Here's the mental shift that makes this whole method click. The top of the bed is where your best stuff belongs. That's where seeds germinate. That's where young roots first spread. That's where compost, biology, and texture matter most, in a way plants can actually use right now. That upper zone is active. That's the layer doing the immediate work. So yes, you want good material there. You want a top layer that feels alive, something crumbly, dark, moisture-friendly, not dense, not dead, not full of chunks that dry out into a brick. But the lower part of the bed, that doesn't need to be premium potting mix buried in the dark forever. It needs to support the system above it. That's a completely different job. The lower zone can give you bulk. It can hold moisture. It can create air pockets. It can slowly decompose. It can become the deep engine of the bed instead of just expensive filler. And this is where a lot of people overspend without realizing it. They think they're buying fertility, but what they're really buying is volume. Volume is the expensive part when you do it the lazy retail way. Fertility is the part you can place strategically. That's a big difference. So the goal here is not to cheap out and throw junk in a box. That would be the wrong lesson. The goal is to stop wasting your best material on the part of the bed that doesn't need to be treated like a seed-starting mix. You're not making the bed worse. You're making each layer do a more honest job. And once you see the bed that way, yard waste stops looking like trash. It starts looking like structure. It starts looking like stored moisture. It starts looking like future organic matter. And suddenly the question is not, how many more bags do I have to buy? It becomes, what do I already have on this property that can do useful work down there? That question is where the savings start. But more than that, that's where the long-term payoff starts too, because now you're not just filling a container. You're building a bed that changes over time, preferably in your favor. When people hear fill the bottom with yard waste, they sometimes picture some random, messy pile shoved into a bed to save money. That is not the idea. The idea is that different materials do different jobs, and once you respect those jobs, the whole method starts making sense. Take thick logs or old untreated branches first. Those are your long-term bulk. They take up space that you would otherwise pay to fill with bagged soil, yes, but that's not all they do. Over time, they also act like a slow sponge. They soften. They hold water. They become habitat for decomposition. They stop being wood in the way you first think of wood and start becoming part of the bed's internal structure. Then you move into smaller sticks and twiggy material. That layer matters because it prevents everything from compressing into one heavy, soggy mass. It creates irregular space. It helps the bed breathe a bit. It bridges the big wood and the finer material above it. Then you bring in leaves. Dry leaves are not glamorous, but they are incredibly useful. They're carbon. They're fungal food. They're one of the most common materials people have in ridiculous abundance and somehow still treat like garbage every fall. Shredded leaves are even better, but whole leaves still have value here. They help occupy space and feed the slow breakdown process. Then you need something green or nitrogen-rich. This part really matters, because if you build a bed heavy on woody carbon and never balance it, the system can temporarily pull nitrogen into the decomposition process instead of leaving enough in the active planting zone. That's one reason some DIY builds disappoint people. They copy the logs in the bottom part, skip the balancing part, and then decide the whole method is bad. Usually, the method is not the problem. Usually, the build was incomplete. So this is where fresh grass clippings, kitchen greens, aged manure, half-finished compost, or other nitrogen-rich material can do real work. Not as a magical ingredient, just as balance. And then finally, at the top, you lay down the good stuff. That's where your best compost goes. That's where your best soil blend goes. That's where you spend with intention. And I think that's the point that makes this method feel less like a trick and more like actual gardening intelligence. You're not hiding garbage in a box. You're assigning jobs. The wood handles bulk and long-term moisture. The sticks help with structure. The leaves bring carbon. The greens bring balance. And the top layer becomes the part you really garden in. That's a very different picture from just buy 16 more bags. One reason bad gardening advice spreads so easily is that it gets delivered like one universal truth. Same bed, same recipe, same outcome. Everybody nods. Real gardens do not work like that. A method can be solid and still need to be interpreted by climate. And actually, that's one of the strengths of this system. It bends. In a colder state like Minnesota, raised beds have a real advantage because they warm up earlier in spring. That part is great. It gives people a psychological win and often a practical head start too. But there's a catch. The taller the bed gets, the faster it can dry out, especially once warm weather settles in. So in that kind of climate, the lesson is not just raise the bed and you're done. The lesson is that your top layer needs to be genuinely worth something, and the lower layers need to help with moisture instead of working against it. That's where a wood core organic fill approach starts making more sense. Not because it's trendy, because it helps answer a real problem. You want the early warming benefit of the raised bed, but you do not want to create a giant drying box that demands constant rescue watering by July. Now, shift to a place like Oklahoma, and the logic gets even more interesting. There, a wood-filled raised system can function almost like a moisture management strategy, not perfectly, not magically, but meaningfully. Instead of treating branches, logs, leaves, and landscape debris like a disposal problem, you're turning them into a bed that can absorb, slow, and hold water better than a dead mineral fill. That is a very different use case. Same broad method. Different pressure. In one place, the system helps you stretch moisture and support the bed through warmth and drying. In another place, it starts overlapping with stormwater thinking, runoff thinking, water retention thinking. That range matters, because it makes the method feel real, not internet real, garden real. And I'd actually keep that in the script because it does something important for trust. It tells the viewer this is not a rigid doctrine. It's a way of building the bed so the bed itself starts doing more of the work. That's the promise, not perfection, just a better division of labor between you and the bed. So let's make this practical. If I were filling a new raised bed this way, I would start at the bottom with the biggest untreated wood I had available. Not pressure-treated scraps, not painted lumber, not mystery construction debris. I want clean plain wood, old branches, small logs, chunkier pieces from pruning or storm cleanup, that kind of thing. I'm not trying to pack them in like bricks. I'm just building a rough lower skeleton. After that, I'd move in with smaller branches and twiggy material to fill the awkward gaps. This is where the bed starts feeling less hollow and more connected. Then I'd add a carbon-rich layer. Leaves are ideal for this because most people already have them. If the leaves are shredded, even better. If not, still useful. Cardboard can be used lightly in a build like this too, especially as part of a transition layer, but I wouldn't overdo it. I don't want to build a sealed lasagna. I want materials that can break down and breathe. Then I want nitrogen. That could be fresh grass clippings, as long as they're clean and not loaded with herbicide residue. It could be aged manure. It could be half-finished compost. It could be green garden waste. The point is not to be fancy here. The point is to keep the woody lower mass from becoming too carbon-heavy and hungry. Then, on top, I'd finish with the layer that actually matters most right now. A rich planting zone. That's where your purchased material belongs. That's where a good raised bed mix earns its keep. That's where compost pays off immediately. And this is also the point where I think brand names help the listener picture reality. If somebody wants to use a Kellogg raised bed mix for that upper layer, great. That makes sense there. If they prefer a Miracle-Gro raised bed product for the planting zone, fine. The issue was never that branded soil is useless. The issue was burying the whole budget where the plant doesn't need premium texture from top to bottom. That's the distinction. And I'd also be honest about what I would avoid. I would not use treated wood in a vegetable bed fill. I would stay away from black walnut material because of the risk of juglone sensitivity with certain crops. And I would not act like every wood behaves the same. Some dense, rot-resistant woods break down much more slowly. That doesn't always make them wrong, but it changes the speed of the system, and that matters. Then, once the bed is built, I'd water it in well. Really well. Not because water magically activates a trend, but because dry organic layers need help settling and making contact. A bed like this should feel intentionally built, not like a pile you hope turns into soil by accident. That difference shows up later. This, to me, is where the argument gets stronger. Because saving money is nice, obviously, but just saying spend less is not enough. Spend less on what? So you can do what instead? That's the better question. If you stop burying premium bagged mix all the way to the bottom, you free up room in the budget for things that actually improve the active growing zone. Maybe that means a simple rainbird drip setup so your watering is slower, steadier, and less wasteful. Maybe it means a bag of Job's Organics to support hungry crops through the season. Maybe it means more compost for the top few inches, where it actually changes root behavior. Maybe it means mulch. Honestly, mulch alone solves more avoidable frustration than people want to admit. A properly mulched raised bed loses less moisture, swings less wildly, and generally behaves more like a bed with some sense in it. That's the value contrast I'd want the viewer to feel. Not this vague, you can save money line that everybody says. I'd want them to feel the trade. Do you want to bury another stack of expensive bags where they're mostly acting as filler? Or do you want that same money going toward irrigation, fertility, compost, mulch, and the top layer your plants are actually living in? That is a much better use of resources. And it also changes the emotional tone of the project. Now, the bed doesn't feel like a one-time expensive purchase that you have to keep feeding forever. It starts feeling like an asset, something you build once, then tune. Something that gets easier to manage because the structure itself is helping. That's really the heart of this whole piece. A raised bed should not just be a nice-looking container that empties your wallet in spring. It should become a working system. I think this part matters because too many garden videos sell the payoff and skip the honesty. So here's the honest version. A bed built this way is not a magic trick, it is not instantly mature. And the first season may not be the most impressive season. If the nitrogen balance is weak, some crops can look hungry. If the lower layers settle, the soil line can drop more than people expect. If the top layer is too thin, the bed can feel rougher in the beginning than a fully purchased soil fill. That does not mean the system failed. It means the system is active. Beds like this settle. That's normal. Beds like this often want a compost top-up. Also normal. Beds like this reward people who pay attention during the first year instead of expecting a one-and-done miracle. That part should be said out loud because it actually protects the viewer from disappointment. And weirdly, that honesty makes the method sound stronger, not weaker, because then when you describe the year 2 payoff, it doesn't sound like hype. It sounds earned. By the second season, a well-built bed often starts feeling darker, softer, more integrated. Water doesn't disappear the same way. The soil has more internal life. The whole thing feels less like a box you filled and more like a bed that has started becoming itself. That's the stage people usually want from the beginning. They want resilience. They want less watering panic. They want less hauling. They want to stop buying material just to maintain the illusion of a garden system that never really developed any depth. And that's why I think this style of raised bed filling is so compelling when it's done right. It respects time. It assumes the bed can improve instead of just deplete. That is such a better story than the annual shopping cart model. So no, I don't think the lesson here is that bagged soil is a scam and every store product is the enemy. That's too easy and honestly too sloppy. The better lesson is that retail gardening has trained people to solve every problem with purchased volume, when a lot of those problems are really design problems. If you understand what each layer of a raised bed is supposed to do, you stop treating the whole bed like one giant pot. You start building with purpose. The top is your high-value growing zone, the middle transitions. The bottom stores bulk, moisture, and long-term organic matter. And the materials around your yard stop being clutter you need to remove and start becoming inputs with a real role in the system. That shift matters, because once a gardener feels that, they stop being dependent on the yearly reset mentality. They stop thinking, how much more do I need to buy? And start thinking, how do I make this bed hold more life, more moisture, and more stability with what I already have? That is a better gardening instinct. It's calmer. It's cheaper in the right way. It's more resilient. And maybe the biggest thing is, it gives the raised bed a future. Not just a first season, a future. You're no longer building a pretty box and pouring product into it. You're building a structure that processes waste, holds water, feeds biology, and improves with age. That is the real payoff, not just saving money once. Building something that gradually asks less from you while giving more back. And for a raised bed, that's about as good as it gets.